Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our March 31st edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features a growing season forecast from Iowa's State Climatologist Dr. Glisan. And later in the episode, we'll bring on two in-house experts to talk about the important topic of farm succession planning. We'll start with Dr. Glisan, who recently sat down with Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond to discuss his forecast for the spring planting season.
Justin, welcome. Thanks for being with us today to talk weather. So it seems like the past few years, the weather word we hear most about is drought. Can you give us an update on the current drought conditions in Iowa, and are there specific areas more affected than others right now?
Yeah, great question. And drought is on the forefront of everybody's mind, given that from basically spring of 2020 through May of 2024, a record drought across the state. The longest drought since the 1950s, in fact, with the ninth wettest start last year through June, with a record severe weather season that we saw over 125 tornadoes, hail events, straight-line wind events. With those severe weather events, thunderstorms, rainfall, we were able to finally bust that 4-year drought. You know, when you have a drought of that length, you have hydrological impacts that are lasting. So you think of deeper aquifers, you think of shallow well fields, soil moisture, stream flows to some degree. So with the driest September on record, 51st driest October, we slid back into drought across the northern half of the state. So if you look at drought conditions right now, D1 across about 60% of the state, with a little pocket of D2 around Sioux City. Southern Iowa, drought-free, some abnormal dryness, that D0 category, not drought, but more reflective of 30 to 60-day dryness. So is this current drought situation connected to the past 4 years of drought? Yes and no. December 2023 and the preceding 48 months, the fifth driest 4 years on record. We're also working on some of the warmest stretches of 12, 24, 36, 48, 60 months. So we've coupled that drier signal that we've had recently with the warmer temperatures, which also help to exacerbate drought conditions. With the wet start we had last year, we've replenished some soil moisture profiles with a wetter few weeks that we've had. Several systems come through along with rain and snow. We've increased soil moisture, at least in the shallow profile. We're getting deeper infiltration. But one thing that we've discussed through wintertime, the fourth least amount of snow on the ground for the state in 138 years of records.
Snow drought.
So with a lack of snowpack, we had a deeper frost depth. Now, that was concerning in the fact that if we were to get any kind of rainfall, we would see more runoff than infiltration. Luckily, with how warm it's been through late winter into early spring, we got that frost depth out. So we're infiltrating moisture back into the profile, and hence we have seen some improvement in drought conditions. But right now, given the length of the previous drought, the precipitation deficits that we've seen recently, we'll probably see status quo in drought conditions if we see normal precipitation moving forward through spring. Now, if we don't see normal precipitation, we could see drought conditions expand as vegetative demand increases and as atmospheric demand increases.
So we've heard the terms El Nino and La Nina for years and years and years. Quick refresher on both of those and how each affects Iowa's weather. I think the latest shows us currently in a weak La Nina, heading towards transition this summer.
Correct. So yes, El Nino and La Nina are part of a larger scale multi-decadal oscillation or climate pattern in the Pacific called ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. Southern Oscillation is a large-scale climate driver that works on a multi-decadal timescale. El Nino and La Nina are a smaller scale phase, with El Nino being warm, La Nina being cold. The Pacific Oceanic Basin around the equator, especially in the eastern Pacific, if those waters are warmer than average, we would classify that as an El Nino. why we care about the oceanic temperature is that when you have those warmer waters in the eastern Pacific, thunderstorms are more likely to form because they like that heat and moisture to fuel them. Now, in a weak La Nina, which we're currently in, those warmer waters shift west in the basin. Where those thunderstorms are impacts the weather across the United States because it impacts a large-scale jet stream. So last winter, strong El Nino event, second warmest winter on record. We transitioned into neutral conditions, so in between El Nino and La Nina. And when we were looking at the outlooks last year, around this time, in fact, we were seeing a warmer and wetter signal. That suggested to us more thunderstorms, and we talked about the severe weather that we had. So currently we're in a weak La Nina, meaning colder sea surface temperatures in the eastern part of the basin, thunderstorm activity pushed further west, and that impacts where the jet stream sets up and the storm track sets up over the United States. So with El Nino or La Nina being the dominant climate driver over the last few years, it's not always the case, but when they are, we can look back at analog years in which we've seen the behavior and produce outlooks. So if you're looking at the outlooks for a weak La Nina transition to ENSO neutral conditions in the March, April, May timeframe, going back to 2000, the outlooks are generally cooler across the upper Midwest, but also near normal to slightly wetter across west to east across the state of Iowa. Usually in weak La Nina years, we have a bullseye for above average precipitation in the Ohio Valley. That probability has shifted slightly. So if you look at the April outlooks for precipitation, they are leaning wetter across the eastern half of Iowa, but no clear signal on temperature.
So as we kind of transition and think about the spring forecast, then what are we looking at for temperatures and precipitation for April, May, June, and then let's go ahead and get into summer and fall?
If you look at April, May, June, we're not getting a clear signal right now. It's called equal chances. We're, in fact, between the probability of being above or below average on both temperature and precipitation. So that's where we look at current behavior, the amount of soil moisture availability. If you have wetter soils, more chances with low-level humidity also of firing off thunderstorms, more precipitation. If we do get into a drier stretch, we start to dry those soils out as vegetative demand increases. Again, drought conditions can expand, but those soil conditions can impact temperature behavior. Now, again, mentioning the March, April, May outlooks, when we have a weak La Nina transition to neutral conditions, we do see some semblance of colder and wetter conditions possible. Now, as you get into April, May, June, the wettest months of the year for Iowa and for much of the Corn Belt, we're thunderstorm driven. So the fingerprints of La Nina or El Nino start to diminish as you get into the summertime because our precipitation is driven by thunderstorm activity. So we have what we call a spring barrier. And the spring barrier basically is a barrier from the synoptic scale, large scale weather patterns in the wintertime, transitioning to what we call mesoscale or thunderstorm driven precipitation in summer. So when we try to peer past that spring barrier right now to get a better idea of what summertime behavior could be, it's more difficult. And in fact, we don't like to make any kind of predictions for summertime behavior. Now, of course, we can look at analog years. Last year, we were looking at, again, that transition from ENSO neutral back to El Nino, possibly. And then that transition from La Nina to ENSO neutral, we had some peer-reviewed journals out there that suggested when you see that transition, summertimes are typically warmer and drier. The summertime last year was near normal both. So that's, again, why we don't want to go past the robustness of our climate models that are giving us indicators. But overall, you look at the last several growing seasons beside 2024, the wettest months of the year were below average, well below average, and that's where we saw drought conditions expand and persist. So hopefully we've shaken that out of the system. And if we talk in a month or two, I'll have a better idea for you.
Well, we're coming up on planting season and the farmers are getting ready to go. You talked a little bit about subsoil moisture. Let's expand on that a little bit. Where are we at with subsoil moisture? What can farmers expect as they get into the fields?
Across much of the state, we're still on the drier side. Now, if you were to ask me this question last year, or the 3 preceding years, I would tell you that the profile soil moisture was in a dire situation given the drought conditions. I was apprehensive in terms of the lack of snowfall that we had through winter times, 18th driest winter on record. Now, wintertime is the driest season, and as we get through late winter into early spring, we start to ramp up rainfall potential, and that's what we've seen over the last several weeks. So we have seen some shallow improvement, go down 4 inches, talking with farmers across the state, enough to plant into. But with that deeper soil moisture profile going down to root depth, we definitely need more rainfall. Near normal or above average would be ideal to keep those soil profiles replenished as vegetative demand increases, but also as we enter the warmest months when the atmospheric demand, especially how windy it's been, can extract shallow soil moisture pretty easily.
Any long-term planning that farmers can do? Weather is very unpredictable and has a huge impact on agriculture. So any strategies that farmers can consider to mitigate risk this year?
One of the mitigation strategies we talk about are planting cover crops, also no-till practices, having residue on top of bare soils. Because we're seeing more intense rainfall events, you get more soil runoff if you're on bare soil. So having those cover crops there, the no-till practices, locks that soil in, but also locks in soil moisture. So if we do get dry, there is at least some moisture in the ground because it's being locked in place. Have a rain gauge, a CocoRa's rain gauge, a community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network. I can use that data for the U.S. Drought Monitor recommendation each week, but we can also use that data for crop indemnity, CRP, all kinds of state and federal programs that rely on National Weather Service and CocoRa's data. We can use that data to produce a better drought depiction for our counties, and then our counties can do a better job of getting the monies that our farmers rely on in terms of wet or dry extremes. Moving forward into the next several years, next several decades, our wet and dry extremes are only going to get more extreme. I think of 2018 as a good proxy year for this. The wettest year for the northern third of the state, D3 drought conditions in southeastern Iowa. You'd only have to go 4 or 5 counties north or south to be in one historic extreme or the other. We're starting to see that more often. So having those types of practices, being cognizant of the amount of rainfall that's falling, given it's becoming more spatially variable. The drought monitor is not as fine of a tool at that county scale, so having more rain gauges out there and more observations. And heck, even farmers and producers call me or send me an email about what they're seeing out on their farms. Doesn't match up necessarily with what the drought monitor's saying, whether bad or good. We can make tweaks to that, send in better recommendations to the federal author each week. So any information that can be provided to my office or the National Weather Service only helps us do a better job for our farmers.
You made a great point on conservation. We're seeing a lot more implementation of cover crops, buffer strips, no-till, those kind of things. Are you seeing that from our farmers in Iowa? Are we seeing more of that?
Absolutely. I do a lot of field scouting on the road a lot. Our farmers are cognizant of keeping the water on the landscape, whether we're in dry conditions or shunting that water off and perhaps storing it when we get into very wet conditions. So the conservation practices that I've seen across the state and across the Corn Belt in general help reassure me that even as we see extreme events become more extreme, that our farmers are becoming more resilient and adaptive to these mitigation measures.
You also discussed tools that farmers can use. I know there are other tools available to farmers as they watch the weather, freeze and frost, rainfall, storm predictions. Where can they look for this information?
Yeah, so easily if you Google Iowa Climatology Bureau, it'll bring you to the department's website. All that information is linked there. My contact information as well. USDA Climate Hub up in Ames puts out tremendous tools that we push to our farmers and producers. Soil temperature climatology, rainfall maps, previous drought maps to get an idea of changes that we've seen in the drought monitoring techniques. We've heard of flash drought, we've heard of snow drought. So lack of precipitation, lack of snow, but a rapid intensification of drought conditions, particularly during the growing season. working on flash drought indicators with NASA and other state climatologists and offices around. So those tools are online. Sometimes they're hard to find. That's part of my job, is to be a clearinghouse for this information and to get it out to our farmers and producers. So being on podcasts like this helps spread the word.
Maybe some last thoughts, advice for the ag community this year.
So, as I mentioned, Iowa farmers are some of the most resilient farmers on earth. We have some of the richest soils on earth. It's a beautiful state. And part of the honor of being in my position is I get to talk with farmers and producers on a daily basis. And they see the changes that we've seen in the landscape in terms of extreme events and have reached out. You think of the August 10th, 2020 derecho, a tremendous loss across the state that tipped over or snapped corn. Farmers found a way to get combines over it. But those are the types of events, while they don't happen that often, that we have to plan for in the future. So my colleagues across the state, both state and federal agencies that I work with, are trying to get out more and talk to farmers and talk to groups across the state and across our region. So a parting thought here is, if you need a presentation, if you need data, if you need observations for your production or for your farm, that's part of the reason I'm here. That's why I'm in office. So please reach out. Contact information again, 515-281-8981. I answer my own phone, so I always give you a call back, and I'm happy to provide any information that you need.
Thanks, Justin. It's always helpful to look ahead and try to anticipate what farmers could be facing when we start planting and during the early growing season. If you'd like to hear more from Dr. Glisan, especially as we get closer to planting, we've given you a few ways to do that down in the notes for this podcast episode. In the notes, you'll see how to register for a free webinar Dr. Glisan is presenting for Farm Bureau on April 10th. There's also a link to the Iowa Department of Ag's Climatology Bureau and a link with information to contact Dr. Glisan directly with your questions. Next up is a topic we've covered extensively over the years: farm succession planning. Established in 2013, Iowa Farm Bureau's Take Root program has helped more than 7,400 farmers and their family members, including folks in every county in Iowa, develop plans to transition the farm from one generation to the next. Today, we're bringing you the Iowa Farm Bureau staffer who leads that Take Root program, Amanda Van Steenwyk, and an attorney with nearly 2 decades of experience in farm succession strategy, Erin Herbold-Swalwell. Amanda and Erin recently sat down with Spokesman reporter Corey Munson.
Today, I'm joined by Amanda Van Steenwyk and Erin Herbold-Swalwell, hosts of Iowa Farm Bureau's Take Root seminars, which help Iowa families successfully plan for farm transitions. To start off with, Amanda, can you tell us, when we say the term farm transition, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, so often we'll use farm transition and farm succession as interchangeable terms. And that means that there's a family aspect to that, there's a tax aspect, financial aspect, and a legal aspect to it as well. So the estate plan is very much part of that transition or succession plan, but there's also the managing of the family dynamics that go along with the succession plan as well as an estate plan. So, and it's a continuous process. It's not something that you put into place and you don't look back at it in the future years. It's something that you want to keep coming back to and reviewing and tweaking as time goes on and families and life changes.
So ultimately, it is just kind of setting up the framework for moving the farm between generations if there's an expected transition or an unfortunate unexpected transition.
Yes, correct. You're going to have some planned transitions and some unplanned transitions. And it's all that, like you said, that framework of bringing in those next generations to operate that farming operation.
And Corey, I think just adding on to what Amanda was saying, I want to point out too that it's not just death that we're thinking about as a transition. we're thinking about, too, what about disability or accidents that may happen or illness that could occur, divorce, unfortunately. There are those things that we don't like to think about happening during our lives, but there are things that we need to be talking about along the way. So that's all part of the transition and part of the plan that people need to keep in mind as well.
Can you each share with us the topics you cover during a Take Root seminar? And Amanda, let's start with you.
Yeah, we open the workshops with a lot of trying to get the understanding of what exactly a succession plan is, the importance of communication, talk through generational differences, focus on getting families motivated to have family meetings and have some proactive discussions, and then also some goal settings to help formulate those conversations as well.
And then after that, I jump in and start covering, okay, what are some of the legal tools that can assist us and that we need to understand before talking with an attorney and going in and starting the process. And so one of the things that we really like to set people up with and our farm families up with is just a good knowledge base of what do they need to know going into this process. And then the goal is to save them some time, to save them some effort and some money along the way to be able to, know what is a trust, what is a will, what kind of entities like limited liability companies do people use in their planning, if they do that at all. What are some things that estate planning attorneys will commonly ask during a meeting? Those kind of things that, sometimes it can be or seem like an overwhelming process to go in and have that first meeting with an attorney, and maybe that stops people from making that initial appointment. And so what we want to do is just raise everyone's comfort level with having that conversation.
At these seminars, or just in your roles at Farm Bureau in general, what are some of the common questions you hear from Iowans when it comes to the subject of farm transition?
There are questions all across the board when it comes to farm transitions, and a lot of it goes to the very beginning of how do I get my family to focus on this or have the initial conversation of what our transition plan is. And another common one is, if there is a plan, can we talk about it? Can we all know what is happening within that plan?
We get the comment a lot, who should be involved in that conversation? And I think where that's coming from, and you can chime in on this too, but it's coming from, okay, do we include the kids at first? Do we include our on-farm heir, the person that's going to come back and be involved in the farming operation if we have one of those kids that are coming back? Do we include them first? How do we actually do that? And I guess the answer is, it depends, right? Every family is so different, but I do think that answer usually is include everybody that you can right away. And you tell a story, and I really like it, and maybe you want to share that about your own family.
Yeah. So I have one older brother, and I use the example of if my parents were to say that, okay, Amanda and Jeff is my older brother. We just want you to come to the table and talk about what our farm transition plan looks like. And this is my parents planning the meeting. If my brother and I were to just show up, I would probably return to my spouse and tell him that all these stories, probably with a little more emotional flair than what actually happened. And then if my brother were to return to his wife and tell her what happened, and she asked, how did the meeting go? He would probably respond with, it was fine. So neither one of our spouses have, the full detail of what was actually talked about within our family meeting and our parents' succession plan. So I do think it is, as Erin mentioned, important to bring everybody to the table. And at what point you bring them to the table is probably different for each family. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges within a transition plan is no one family or one farm is going to have the exact same starting point, exact same ending point, and all the things in between. So it really does require families to have conversations not only internally, but also with those advisors along the way.
Well, and I think that leads in perfectly to my next question, because this is a very emotionally charged topic. You're sometimes dealing with literal life and death questions. Why is it important in your experience to have plans in place ahead of a sudden change in farm ownership?
The important thing about having the plans in place prior to a sudden change is that you truly get to pick what you want to happen. Or maybe that tragic event is the owner or the senior generation passing away, or something happening where they can't be an active member on the farm. And if you have those plans in place, you truly get to hear what their wishes, their goals, what they want their legacy to be before it's too late. So having that plan in place, not only with the communication aspect, but also being able to allow the family to continue to be a family.
And I think something that people don't realize or maybe even think about is what happens after a person passes. Obviously, that's a time of stress in a person's life. And oftentimes the person that's administering an estate or acting as an executor or a trustee is also grieving the loss of a family member. And so the more we can do up front to make things more of a seamless transition, or understanding what needs to be done, and we're just kind of putting the plans in place and making them happen, the fewer questions that you have to deal with on the back end after somebody passes away, the better. Because, always remember this, when we were going through my grandma's estate, my dad stopped one day and we were just talking, and he said, I feel like I haven't really even been grieving yet. I haven't thought about that. And I think that that's something that's really important, is you got to work through that and just know that these things take time. Estates and that settlement doesn't happen right away. There's kind of a settlement period, and you just get your plan in place and kind of check off the boxes as you go along.
And Erin, you mentioned making it a seamless transition. And I think when you have the plan in place and you truly take it as a mentorship opportunity as the senior generation or the owner generation, the farm itself will have that seamless transition if you get those things in place, versus your family members having to find passwords and contact folks for all your different business dealings. It's really important to communicate those kinds of things prior to a sudden change having to happen.
Well, and it's your legacy, right? Yeah. What do you want your legacy to be? There's always going to be something that falls through the cracks. Yeah. There's always going to be something like, oh gosh, they forgot that. And I think that brings up one of the biggest things that I notice where families feud over these things is something was a big surprise to one of the heirs. Something just wasn't communicated. And that would be one of the biggest things that I could tell people.
Can you give us one or two pieces of advice that you wish every farm family in the state could hear?
I think that probably one of the biggest pieces is what I just mentioned, is having that communication piece and asking for input too. I have this talk with a lot of people, and I think it's generational, and Amanda can probably speak to this more than I can, but there are definitely differences between the generations, right? And maybe a hesitancy in the senior generation to bring in the next generation when making those decisions on what they want to do with their things, with their land, with the operation that they've built. You would be surprised what that next generation tells you, and you don't know if you don't ask. So make sure that you're actually bringing them in and talking with them, because I think just making sure that everybody understands, like, this is a business, right? And, right now we have farm families that, are dealing with lower incomes and things like that, higher input costs. And I think everybody should know those are the challenges, and making sure that those siblings that live far away understand that this is the reality. And I think that's really important, is keeping them in the loop and don't lose touch with them on those things.
Yeah, mine would be very similar to that, is just start talking, start having conversations. We often focus on the money, the legal aspects of it all, but an important piece of it too is providing that, what we'll refer to as an emotional inheritance as well, focusing on what you want your legacy to be as you go through this transition, helping those generations manage the financial inheritance that they will get. There's an important part of that we often forget about because we get so stuck in the details of what trust is going to fit for us, what are the tax implications, but there is an aspect of it of just dealing with our family and teaching our family and bringing our family in to fully understand what that farming operation looks like. So really just start the conversation. You got to start somewhere and manage those expectations of your family members. I spoke to one gentleman recently who had sat through our Take Root workshops, and he said, you know what, I went and I spoke to my daughter and my son. My son's been on the farm for 20 plus years. My daughter moved away, has a military spouse, but recently told me that she had expectations of being involved in the farm. And I said to him, I go, did you ask what that meant to her, being involved in the farm? She's like, well, no. So he called me about a week later and he said, well, her expectation of being on the farm was she just wanted 5 acres to build a cabin for her family to come back to and see the farm. So just really having those conversations and digging deep into what all the generational expectations are and things like that is an important part of it.
That seems a little bit more doable than her coming back and, jumping into raising cattle the next day.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And I think that leads into never force your kids to do business together. I mean, at least have some language in your documents that if they are going to operate a business together, they have a way out, right? Because maybe that first generation can stay together and keep that going. But as the next generation comes on board, things can change.
And a lot of our responses are in the situations of having an on-farm error. But at every single workshop, we get a question of, well, I don't have an on-farm error. I have children that are very successful in their own right of off-farm careers. What does that transition, that succession, that estate plan look like for me? And that conversation looks a little bit different, but it's still very important to have those conversations. And a lot of times our response is, well, get involved in the community to find young farmers, because they're out there that want to expand their operation or be involved in a family operation and have that mentorship opportunity.
I always tell Amanda this when she usually invites me to do a panel or something at our Young Farmers Conference. And it just restores my hope in the next generation. There are so many really wonderful people that attend that conference that just want a chance to farm.
Well, and I know you both just wrapped up a series of those Take Root seminars in February. Will there be any more sessions offered this year?
Yes, we are working on our summer plan. We'll have a few locations in the summer. Our summer dates will be coming out on our website at iowafarmburo.com/takeroot. So stay tuned on the website to see those dates and locations.
And the fact that folks keep coming, if you build it, they will come to the Take Root program after all these years. It truly shows that there is a need, and it's really great to be able to be involved in it. So I truly appreciate Amanda for bringing me in and us getting to spend all this lovely time together.
As you just heard from Amanda and Erin, successful farm transition planning starts long before you need it. There really is a lot to consider as you map out your family farm's legacy, so please do take advantage of Iowa Farm Bureau's Take Root program. Take Root workshops are free for Iowa Farm Bureau members, and as Amanda mentioned, we'll soon be announcing new workshop dates and locations for the summer. For those details, check iowafarmbureau.com/takeroot. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some helpful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on April 14th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.